Chapter 5. After breakfast the following morning, Savannah asked, "Do you mind if I practice driving around the ranch while you're out? I'd like to get as skilled as I can as quickly as possible. I would hate to have to ask you to drive me to job interviews." It would be as bad as her mother taking the subway with her to her first job as a bistro in a coffee shop. Oh wait, that had already happened. Scott frowned. "I don't mind if you practice, but I'll probably take you to at least the first few job interviews, regardless. I don't want to worry about you getting lost." She looked at him with a frown. "Your truck has GPS." He shrugged. "I would just feel safer if I took you." She didn't say anything, but she noted that his keys were left on the counter when he left for the day. She wasn't certain why he was worried about her driving off by herself, but there was obviously something going on there, and she would need to speak with him about it. She spent a couple of hours applying for jobs online. There were 2 in small towns in the area and 2 in Billings. She had a feeling that Scott wouldn't want her working in Billings. She glanced at the clock when she was finished with her applications and went out to the truck. She would have no problem getting lunch ready on time, as she just planned on making burgers and the meat was already thawed. She climbed into the huge truck, happy that she didn't have to adjust the seat because she'd been the last one to drive it. She practiced stopping and starting, parking and turning. She was in the truck for over an hour before she went in to start lunch. When Scott walked into the house for lunch, he could smell lunch cooking, and his bad mood melted away. He was worried that by working outside the home, Savannah wouldn't do the things around the house that he felt needed to be done. They didn't need the money anyway. "Lunch smells good," he told her as he wandered into the kitchen, kissing her cheek. "I didn't have a lot of time," she told him, "so I just made burgers and chips. I hope that's all right." He nodded. "It sounds good to me. We're going to need to make a run into King for groceries soon, aren't we?" In his mind, if the pantry and freezer were both full of groceries, then the meals would be better. He loved having a wife who was cooking 3 meals a day. It made him feel like he was loved, whether she said the words or not. "We really are. I enjoy cooking, so it's nice to be able to do it during the summer this way." "What do you mean? You won't be cooking at all during the school year?" That couldn't be what she meant, could it? "Of course I don't mean that." She gave him a strange look. "I will still cook all the time on the weekends, but I'll probably put a lot more meals in the crock pot before leaving for work. I'll make simpler meals on nights that I'm working." She loved experimenting with new recipes, and a crock pot was the best way to do it. "Is working more important to you than our marriage?" he asked, knowing he was being slightly belligerent but not caring at all. His mother had cared enough about him and his father that she stayed home and kept house, making certain every meal was done before his father came in from a hard day of work. Why couldn't his wife do the same? She was hurt that he'd even ask that. "No, it's not more important, but it is important. I enjoy what I do. We don't need the money. Can't you enjoy keeping house and cooking meals?" Savannah counted to 10 before responding. "I didn't go to school for 4 years to stay home. After children, yes, I will embrace staying home and raising babies. Before? Why would I waste my time? Cooking for me is a waste of time?" She shook her head. "You weren't starving to death when we married, Scott. You kept yourself fed. Why do I need to be the one to cook meals for you now that we're married? Why can't you go on doing what you did before? Because you're my wife, and it's your job to do it." Why didn't she just know that? Wives cooked for their husbands. "My mother always worked, and in our house, my dad was the cook before he died. He was a better cook than my mother, so it was his chore. Why can't we just do what makes sense for us at any given time? Why do we have to plan on me not working so that I can cook meals that you don't need me to cook anyway? Were all men this illogical? You're supposed to do it out of a desire to take care of me. Don't you have that desire? What kind of woman had Lachelle told him to marry? Why couldn't she see that one of the most basic things a woman did for her husband was cook for him and clean for him? So what you're saying is if I work, I'll still be responsible for all the cooking and all the housework. Is that it? Surely, he was joking. She kept waiting for him to tell her that he didn't mean it, but it just wasn't happening. Of course you will. I don't have time for it. I have a ranch to run. Who did your cleaning before we were married? This house has been cleaned many times since your mother died. I know what a filthy house looks like, and this house was not filthy when I arrived. Why was he being so difficult about this? Did he honestly think she should just throw the years she'd worked for her teaching degree down the drain? I had a housekeeper, but I let her go before I went to New York to marry you. Why would I need a housekeeper and a wife? Did it never occur to you that your wife, who you knew was from New York, was a career woman? Did that thought not enter your pea-brain? He stood up, bracing his hands on the table. Pea-brain? Are you calling me stupid? Savannah had enough. She couldn't remember ever being so angry in her life. What was wrong with him that he'd think she should give up her entire life for him? It wasn't enough that she'd pulled up roots and moved halfway across the country for him? If the pot fits, she yelled, wear it. She threw the rest of her burger at his head, pleased when ketchup and mustard clung to his face. And the dishes? Hell will freeze over before I do them. She walked out of the dining room and up the stairs, determined to take a nice hot shower to wash all of her anger away. Scott stood at the table for a moment, not believing she'd actually thrown something at him, and then just calmly walked off as if nothing had happened. What was wrong with her? He started to follow her up the stairs, but he knew it was the wrong thing to do in anger. Instead, he went into the kitchen, washed his face, and left to go back to work. By the end of the day, everyone knew he was having marital trouble. The men were shying away from him as if he were a wounded grizzly bear. Finally, his foreman, Jesse Fields, rode up beside him. "Want to tell me what your problem is, boss? What makes you think there's a problem?" Scott snapped back, his blue eyes lit with the fire of anger. "Well, I don't know. Maybe it's the way you're yelling at everyone, whether they do something wrong or not. Maybe it's the way you just told Kyle that his mama needs to buy him some clothes that don't hurt your eyes. Or it could be the way you keep glaring toward the house. Why don't you just pick one?" Scott threw one hand up in the air, the other firmly on the reins of his gelding. "I'm a newlywed. We're learning to live together. I see that. Maybe you should knock off an hour or two early, and go home and take your little filly to bed. You'd both feel better for it in the end. I can't touch her when I'm this angry. I'd break her right in half." Jesse laughed. "You'd never hurt a woman in anger. I've seen you cuss your horse up one side and down the other, but you've never hurt him in any way. Not even when he threw you into that freshly thawed stream last winter. I would never hurt an animal. You'd never hurt a woman either, Scott. Go home and talk to your wife. Work it out between you." Scott shook his head. "She won't listen to reason. Do you realize she thinks she should work? She doesn't need to work. I need her at home." Jesse raised an eyebrow. "What kind of work does she do?" "She's an English teacher. No one needs to be able to diagram a stupid sentence to work on a ranch. It's time for her to forget all her holier-than-thou ways and stay home." "Why do you really want her to stay home? It's not like you need her to cook for you. You can eat in the bunkhouse with us, which is what you used to do." "What's the problem?" Scott shrugged. "My mother always stayed home. She had a meal on the table as soon as my dad walked in the door at the end of the day. When I got off the bus from school, she had a cookie waiting for me. And hot chocolate. Who's going to make hot chocolate for the kids?" Jesse shook his head. "Kids? Aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself? Did she say she wants to work after you two have kids? Not that you'll ever have kids if you're already fighting after less than a week of marriage. She said she'd stay home after the kids were born, but why can't she stay home now? My mother never worked. Yes, she did. Scott's head whipped around, and he looked at Jesse with pure astonishment. The man had been with his family for decades, so he knew if anyone knew the details of his parents' early marriage, it was him. She didn't. When your parents first married, she worked at the diner in town. She said she couldn't stand to have idle hands, and there just wasn't enough to keep her busy on the ranch. Once you came along, she stopped working and devoted her whole life to you. But before you were born? She worked at least 30 hours per week. Sometimes more. It drove your dad crazy. And it should have. A woman's place is in the home taking care of her family. Scott's mind was reeling. His mother couldn't have worked. It is. If that's where she wants to be. Your attitude is pretty archaic. Talk to your wife and see what she really wants. Maybe there's a reason she wants to keep working that you two haven't discussed yet. Like what? Maybe she thinks she can really make a difference teaching. Maybe she has another year to pay on her students' loans, or credit cards, or something that she doesn't want you to accept the burden for. Maybe she wants to send money to her white-haired grandmother in Seattle who collects cats. I don't know why. Ask her. Jesse nodded his head toward the house. Go now and ask her. If you keep yelling at the men the way you have been, you won't have any cowboys left. Scott sighed. I guess I have been a bit rude to them today. Just a bit, Jesse lied. I'll go talk to her. Scott was honestly relieved to have a reason to go back to the house. He wanted to talk to her, to tell her he was sorry for being a jerk. He wanted to hear her reasons. He wondered if he could get her to talk to him after the way he'd acted. Asterisk. Savannah was still steaming when she got out of the shower. There was no way she was going to be able to stay married to that man without killing someone. Why had Dr. Simpson matched her up with a man like Scott? Had she lost her mind? Glancing at the clock, she realized that even though it was only 3:30 in Montana, it was after 5 in New York. She pulled out her phone and decided to put her questions to the only woman who could answer them. She called Dr. Simpson's cell phone number, tapping her foot impatiently while she waited for her to answer. Dr. Lashiel Simpson here. What were you thinking? The man is insane. He doesn't want me to work. He thinks I need to cook every meal he eats. He let his housekeeper go before we even married, not knowing if I wanted to work or not. This is never going to work. Savannah felt like she was being unreasonable, but she was more than a little freaked out. How was she supposed to live under these conditions? Ah, Savannah. I've been expecting your call. Was this some kind of joke? Did you deliberately set me up with the man I'd be the least compatible with on the entire planet? Savannah wanted to fly back to New York and strangle the woman. She couldn't remember ever in her life being quite so angry with another human being. Dr. Simpson's calm, sweet voice came over the line. Savannah, I want you to sit down and tell me exactly what happened. You two are going to be great together if you can get past this initial hump. Trust me. The first year of any relationship is the hardest, and you two are just getting to know each other after marriage. You were the one who said we had to meet at the altar. I know. If I hadn't, you two would have dated a few times, realized there was a very strong attraction, and then you would have discussed you working after marriage, and you'd have called it quits. You're perfect for each other. You just have to work through his possessiveness and your reluctance to be cosset. How? Dr. Simpson sighed. I can't do it for you, Savannah. You're going to have to sit down with your husband and talk to him about your feelings, and you're going to have to listen to his feelings. If you two don't talk, you won't be able to work anything out. But But nothing. You wanted to marry a man who would be right for you. A man who wouldn't try to force you into bed with him the second you met. He didn't, did he? Savannah blushed, thinking about the night she'd just had with her husband. No, he was very patient in that regard, but… No buts. My butt is big enough for all three of us. Savannah stood for a moment blinking as her mind registered what the doctor had said. Finally, she burst out laughing. I can't believe you just said that. Are you calmer now? Savannah shook her head, still chuckling. Much, thank you. Then listen to me. You married Scott for better or for worse. The next few months will most likely be the hardest of your marriage. You have the same core beliefs, which is important, but you both have your own personal beliefs, mainly based on how and where you were raised. The two of you need to sit down somewhere and calmly discuss those beliefs. Better yet, you need to make love, and then discuss them. You need to be nice and relaxed for this, because it might take a few hours. Savannah blushed. I don't know. Listen to me. For you two, I would say set a timer. You talk for 10 minutes, and he doesn't get to interrupt, and then he talks for 10, and you don't get to interrupt. The next time you each talk for 5. After that, if you're still not seeing eye to eye, drag him back to bed and start all over again. Even if you don't work out the issues, you'll both be satisfied sexually, and that's almost as good as working through your problems. How have the other couples you've matched through matrimony done? Others? Didn't I tell you that you two were the first, dear? Wait, the first? No, you didn't tell me that. Oops, gotta run. Our new puppy, Margarita, is trying to eat another of the potted plants. She needs to be watched every minute. Have fun. Savannah looked down at the phone in her hand. She'd been hung up on. She shook her head. Maybe the good doctor's methods had something to say for them. They couldn't be worse than what she had in mind, and if they didn't work, well, she could always fall back on plan B and break a vase over his head later if she needed to. Asterisk. Scott rubbed down his horse, even though he was in a hurry to talk to Savannah. Listening to Jessie had helped him realize he needed to make some changes in how he was speaking to his wife. She may not be doing exactly what he wanted her to do, but nowhere in the marriage vows had it said that a wife would stay home and care for the house and cook while the man worked. As he was walking toward the house, he saw some dandelions poking up their heads in an unused pasture. He didn't want to take the time to run to the store to get flowers, so they would do. She would understand what he meant by the gesture surely. When he walked into the house, he searched for her, not seeing her right away. The burger she'd thrown at him was still on the floor where it had landed, and he frowned. Wasn't she over her mat enough to pick up the mess she'd made yet? He decided that since he was going to take the high road this time, he should pick up the mess and throw it away. He dug through the refrigerator and found a bottle of root beer, pouring it into a glass. He put the dandelions into the bottle with a little water and smiled at his creation. He would have made a good florist. He picked up the burger from the floor and wiped up the last of the ketchup from the hardwood floor. Going into the kitchen, he saw that she hadn't touched the lunch dishes, but because he'd upset her, he put them into the dishwasher and started it himself. He went up the stairs, looking for her. Finding her in the bedroom, sitting on the bed with the phone beside her, he walked over and sat beside her. He put his arm around her, half expecting her to flinch away from him. I'm sorry I was such an ass. Savannah looked into his eyes. Do you really think you were? She wouldn't repeat the word he'd used, because she didn't like it, but it did fit his behavior well. He nodded. I talked to Jessie, my foreman. He told me that I was wrong about a few things. Oh? She wanted to hear what he had to say, but she really wasn't certain if she was ready to forgive him quite yet. What were you wrong about? My mother worked until I was born. She worked at the diner in town. She quit when I was born, but she didn't always take care of my dad like I thought she did. He shrugged. I guess I shouldn't have made those assumptions. Savannah sighed. This is about more than what your mother did and didn't do. You can't expect me to be your mother all over again. I'm your wife. My life was different than yours, and our feelings about certain things formed separately. I always had a working mother, and I never felt like I was neglected. Your mother never worked, and you didn't feel neglected. I may decide I want to work after the children are born, just because I love what I do so much. Would that be so wrong? He shook his head slowly. I guess not. I just feel like it's my job to take care of you and any children that come along. We don't need you to work, because I make plenty of money to support a family. It's not about money. It's about me being an adult and able to think on my own. It's about me being able to choose whether or not I want to work. I do want to work, at least until the children start coming and maybe after. But when I work, I want to have a housekeeper in place so that I can come home and cook a meal, but not have to worry about doing the deep cleaning. I think you should have waited until we talked before you let your housekeeper go. She took a deep breath. I should have a say in any decisions made about our household or our new family, because I'm your wife. I shouldn't be the final answer, but I should at least have the right to voice an opinion. He sighed. You're right. I need to at least hear what you have to say. You're a thinking, intelligent human being. I shouldn't have discounted that before even meeting you. She hadn't realized until he said those words that she was holding herself rigidly, and only then did she allow herself to collapse against him. I don't want to be angry with you. I hate fighting. I do too. So this is what I think we should do, but I'll make no final decisions until you've voiced your opinion. Can you see me learning here? She nodded slowly, a bit worried about what he might say next. Go on. I want to be given a chance to court my wife. To woo you. I still want bed privileges, of course, because I'm a man, and we're married, but I want to take you out on dates and act like we're not yet married. I want to make my wife fall in love with me for my charm and devotion to her. Not just because she wants to be my sex slave. Savannah laughed softly. Get the idea of me being your sex slave right out of your head. Never happening. I do like the idea of courting, though. I think we could both use that. Courting with bed privileges. He stroked her cheek with the backs of his fingers. Don't forget the bed privileges. How could I forget the bed privileges? She looked around her. Well, look at that. I think we're on a bed now. He laughed and pushed her back onto the bed, looming over her. I sure hope that was an invitation, because I'm taking it as one. His mouth pressed to hers and his hand stroked her body through her clothes. Last chance to rescind your offer. Her arms came around him. You promised I'd love it the second time, remember? He nodded. Sex slave position will remain open. Chapter 6. Savannah got a call for an interview less than a week later. She was driving every time they left the ranch, which wasn't terribly often, but often enough that she was learning not to be nervous about driving. She drove to the interview, chauffeuring Scott. The interview was for a combination English and history teacher in Pinkston, a small town near them. While she wasn't certified in history, she was only a few hours shy, and when she'd talked to the principal on the phone, he'd indicated it wouldn't be a problem. She parked the truck in the lot behind the small school. Turning to Scott, she asked, Are all schools here so small? This was a public school, and it was as small as her private school back in New York. Not all, but a lot of them are. Pinkston was King's biggest rival. I remember playing their team every single year when I was in high school. Savannah looked at Pinkston High School and didn't see how it could be much of a rival, but what did she know? I'm not sure how long I'll be. He shrugged. I have my phone. I'll probably talk to Jake and see if he's been able to tear himself away from the Manhattan Library yet. Maybe he decided to stay, she said with a grin. I'll be back soon. She rushed to the building and hurried inside, wobbling a bit on her heels. It was the first time she'd worn anything but sandals or sneakers since she'd arrived in Montana, and she was a bit out of practice already. She found the office just inside the front door, and she walked in. I'm here to see Principal Moore. The office smelled a bit stale, which was typical for a school office during the summer. She'd always noticed strange smells during the summer from the lack of use. Of course, more often than not, schools didn't smell exactly fresh during the school year either. Yes, of course. He's expecting you. The secretary didn't ask for her name, which surprised Savannah, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood at the counter, watching as the secretary wandered off to find him. The man who greeted her was in his mid-40s, with dark hair. He wore jeans and a t-shirt. Forgive my attire, he said, glancing at Savannah's business clothes. I'm only here for this interview today, and then it's back to summer vacation with my wife and kids. Savannah couldn't help but smile at him. I hope your vacation is lovely. She held her hand out to him. I'm Savannah Blyton. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she blushed. Forgive me. Savannah Ward. I'll do my best to remember my name before the school year starts. She felt like an idiot, but she knew he would understand. She'd been Blyton for 28 years, and Ward for less than 2 weeks. The principal laughed. Jeff Moore. How long have you been married? About a week and a half, she answered as she followed him into his office, taking a seat in the chair across from his desk. Tell me a bit about yourself. He leaned back in his chair, obviously comfortable. I was born and raised in New York City. I lived there until I married, so I'm a very new resident of Montana. She was pleased with the laid-back structure of the interview, feeling at ease. Mr. Moore leaned forward with a smile. What do you think of our state? Do you think you'll like living here? He seemed to genuinely care about her answer. Oh, I already do. I love the slower pace. I've seen more sunsets from our back porch than I saw in my entire life living in New York. Here, I don't have to go to Central Park to see beauty. It's everywhere around me. She smiled. I can't imagine going back to New York now. He smiled and nodded. That's how I feel about it here. Have you known your husband long? She knew he was trying to make idle chit-chat, but she didn't like the question. It was much too personal, considering the way they'd met. Not long at all. We knew the instant our eyes met that we'd marry. There. It was the truth, but revealed absolutely nothing. I felt that way when I met my wife. Of course, that was in college. He picked up a notepad. Now I see you taught honors English and creative writing in New York. Tell me about your most difficult classroom experience and how you handled it. As Savannah answered question after question, she became confident that the job would be hers. Now, does it bother you that we're only looking for someone for the first semester while Mrs. Hoover is out on maternity leave? Savannah hadn't been prepared for that question, but with the way she and Scott had fought about her teaching, she knew he wouldn't mind, and it would give her time to acclimate. She could always substitute for the second semester, and that could work better for them. She'd done some subbing right out of college and knew the ins and outs of it better than most. After she had thanked him for the interview, she went to the truck. Scott was still talking on his cell phone. When she got in, he said, "Looks like she's done. I'll talk to you later." Did he make it home from New York? She asked. She wondered how much she'd be seeing of her new husband's best friend. He flew in last night. Said he wants to move to Manhattan so he can be a homeless man who lives in the library. Why would anyone want to be homeless in New York? Scott sounded utterly baffled. No idea, she said. He's your friend. And a man. She was beginning to think more and more that she'd never understand the workings of a man's mind. So do you want to have lunch out before we head home? Or did you start something? As far as Scott could tell, the woman cooked every meal in the crock pot. She didn't seem to know how to use the oven, stove, or microwave. He thought about offering to sell them, but didn't think she'd appreciate his sarcasm. He was certain he'd make her mad unintentionally, so he should keep sarcasm to a minimum. We can do lunch out. The meal she'd put in the crock pot that morning wouldn't be ready until supper time. She'd planned on eating out. Do you want to go to the diner in King? Or there's a little restaurant here in Pinkston. Food's not as good, because they don't serve bison, but whatever. I'd be happy with either one, she said quickly. She really didn't care as long as she didn't have to eat her own cooking for a change. Let's just go to the one here then. It'll be good for you to practice driving in a new area. He knew she was about ready for her driver's test. She was an extremely quick learner and was already driving as well as anyone he knew. He didn't know if it was due to age or what, but she was picking it up fast. Almost as fast as she liked to drive. As soon as they walked into the restaurant, a waitress came to seat them. Well, if it isn't Scott Ward. She was tiny with dark hair and brown eyes. She couldn't have been over 5 feet. Savannah looked at Scott. Would they never be able to go anywhere without running into one of his former girlfriends? He'd certainly made it sound like he'd dated very little, but it didn't seem that way when they were out and about. Scott grinned, hugging the girl. Ashley, this is my wife, Savannah. Savannah, this is Ashley. She used to date Jake back when we were in high school. Savannah smiled. It's nice to meet you. Were you in their class at King High as well? Ashley shook her head adamantly. No way. I went to Pinkston. I wasn't supposed to date Jake, because we were rivals, but I did anyway. She picked up 2 menus. Booth okay? Yeah, Booth is great, Scott responded, following the petite brunette through the restaurant. Once they were seated, she pulled out her notepad. What do you want to drink? Just water for me, Savannah told her. I'll have root beer. Scott smiled at the waitress. I can't wait to tell Jake I saw you here. She smiled. Don't tell my husband, but I still have a soft spot for Jake. Tell him to come see me. She winked at Scott, and it was all Savannah could do not to roll her eyes. Scott laughed. That's why you dumped him for Bob, right? Ashley laughed. Exactly. She hurried off to get their drink orders while Scott focused on the menu. They have good fried chicken here. He refused to eat beef. He didn't like it nearly as well, so if he went somewhere that didn't serve bison, he usually ate chicken. Savannah looked over the menu. How's the baked potato soup? He shrugged. I'm not much of a soup eater, but I've heard it's good. Soup was one of Savannah's favorite things. I guess we won't be eating a lot of soup this winter then. I can handle it occasionally, but not more than once a week. Did she like soup that much? How could anyone like soup that much? Ashley brought their drinks back. Do you know what you want? She pulled her notepad out of the pocket of her apron. Is the baked potato soup good? Savannah asked. Oh, it's really good. One of my favorite things on the menu. Scott made a face. Is soup a girl thing? Savannah ignored his question. I'll have the soup and a BLT, please. You still serving breakfast? He asked. I can make anything on the menu happen for you. What are you thinking about? I want a ham and cheese omelet. Heavy on the cheese. He handed his menu back. I'll make it happen. White or wheat toast? White. He waited until she walked off before turning his attention back to Savannah. How'd the interview go? I think it went really well. I didn't realize I was only applying for 1 semester, though. The current teacher is out on maternity leave. She was sure he'd like the idea, but she wasn't certain about whether it was what she wanted. Well, then you can see how you feel about teaching while you're married. We can decide how it works for us. I think a one-semester trial is brilliant. What if I decide I want to keep teaching? How would you feel then? He shrugged. I really don't know. As much as I don't like the idea of you working, I do want you to be happy. Let's try this out. I could always sub for the second semester. Because they're short-term assignments, you might like it better. They had to be able to come up with something that would please both of them. He nodded. Take this if you get it, and it's what you want to do. I'm fine with you subbing, but we'll have to make sure you have a vehicle with GPS. A thought occurred to him for the first time. We're going to need to get you something to drive once you have your license. I need my truck close to home, because I often have to run to pick something up that we didn't know we needed. He took her hand in his. Any dream cars? She laughed and shook her head. I'd never been behind the wheel of a car before last week. How could I have a dream car? She'd take anything with wheels at that point, but she didn't want to tell him that. There was no telling what he'd come up with for her. I had a dream car when I was 5. How could you not have a dream car? Not for the first time, Savannah wondered at the wisdom of putting the two of them together. She enjoyed being with Scott for the most part, but they were total opposites in so many ways. Well, then you can pick out your dream car for me. He shook his head. My dream car is a Camaro. With your propensity to drive too fast, we'd go broke with speeding tickets. I think a minivan would be better for you. Or maybe an SUV. She shrugged, not certain she knew a minivan from a Camaro. Cars had never interested her in any way. Okay. Whatever you think is best. With a minivan, you won't need to get a new car when we start having children. She wondered, not for the first time, if he'd even wanted a wife. He seemed more interested in a housekeeper who would also bear his children and take care of them, while cooking every meal. Sounds fine. Scott frowned. He was working hard to try to find ways to court her, but she was resistant. She had said nothing about the bouquet of dandelions he'd worked so hard to arrange for their table. Maybe a gift was in order? He hadn't gotten her a real gift yet. Do you want to stop at the jewelry store on the way home? You could pick out an engagement ring. She shook her head. I don't need an engagement ring. Besides, that's something a man picks out and gives to the woman he wants to marry before he proposes. Not after they're married. Didn't he understand picking out her own ring wouldn't be romantic at all? If he brought one home and just gave it to her, that would be a great deal more romantic. He frowned. Well, I want to do something special while we're courting. I thought a nice gift would be good. A gift is something you pick out. Not something you have me choose. She knew she was being critical, but he needed to show some initiative for these things. He frowned. I'm not so good at this courting thing. Couldn't she see he was doing everything he could to make her happy? I'm sorry. I'm not making things easy for you, am I? Why don't I plan a date for this evening? She could serve dinner by candlelight and have some music ready on her iPod. She'd set up the speakers and they could dance in the living room. She loved the idea of dancing barefoot with her husband in that huge living room. Maybe she needed to teach him how to do romantic things. He tilted his head to one side. If I let you plan it, do I still get courting points for playing along? She laughed, the sound filling the restaurant. Are we keeping score? He shrugged. Not really, but I did say I'd court you, and I want you to be happy. If I plan our date, it'll be something I want to do with you. Playing along would make me very happy. He nodded. Then I can do that. The waitress set their food in front of them, seeming to want to linger for a moment. So when did you get married? I heard something about it, but no real details. She sighed. News just doesn't travel between here and King as fast as I'd like. Savannah smiled at Ashley. We got married 10 days ago. I still feel like we're on our honeymoon. Ashley smiled. Your accent tells me you're not from around here. New York City, born and raised. Really? Have you ever been to a Broadway show? It's always been my dream to go to a Broadway show. Savannah nodded. My mom and I went at least every other month. Wow. I would love to go to New York just once. Ashley sighed. Hey, if you ever want to go back without Scott, let me know. It would be a really fun place to go for a girl trip. Savannah shrugged. I'll think about it. Of course, I don't see traveling without my husband in my immediate future. Married for 10 days? Ashley laughed. I can take a hint. Just don't smooch at the table. This place is family friendly. She wandered off with her tray. Is there anyone you don't know around here? Savannah wasn't sure if she should be amused or exasperated by running into women he knew every time she turned around. He shrugged. Not a lot. I've lived here my whole life. Didn't you run into people you knew in New York all the time? Not at all. I mean, occasionally, but with a city that size, everyone does not know everyone else. How sad. Sad? She'd never thought of it as sad. Sometimes it was nice to be lost in a room full of strangers. She didn't have to worry about anything, because they were all strangers she'd never see again anyway. I think so. How do you have a sense of community when everyone doesn't know everyone else? He just couldn't imagine constantly being surrounded by strangers. Have you ever gone to a big church? She asked. He nodded, not sure why she'd asked that. I did in college. Then you know that the sense of community in a big church is how you plug into small groups. Like you hook up with a home group or a Sunday school class. She waited for his nod. It's the same in New York. I was part of a teaching community at my school. I knew all the parents of all my students. I was part of my church. I was part of a group of people who lived in the same building, and we'd all end up at the same laundromat. Things like that. It can't be the same. I haven't been here long enough to know that for sure, but no, I don't think it is the same. But neither way is right or wrong. Just different. She took a bite of her soup and smiled. Do you want to try this? She wanted to turn him into a soup lover, so she could make soup whenever she wanted. He shook his head adamantly. No thank you. Asterisk. For supper that night, Savannah arranged the table just how she wanted it, and put candles in the middle. She'd shut off the lights so they could eat by candlelight. She had put candles all over the living room, so they could dance in the dim lights. She loved the idea of eating, and then dancing, and then maybe going out and sitting on the porch for a bit, but she wasn't going to try to plan anything perfectly. If she did, Scott would just find some way to change things, and she didn't want to get frustrated with him. When Scott walked into the dining room after showering that night, he immediately flipped the lights on. I like to be able to see what I'm eating. Savannah walked to him and kissed him, instead of shouting at him like she wanted to do. Take a good look at it then, because we're about to turn the lights back off. Part of the date I've arranged includes eating by candlelight. He shrugged, looking at the meal. What is it? He asked. It's a shepherd's pie. Don't worry, I made it with bison meat. I won't taint you by forcing you to eat beef. If there was one thing she'd learned quickly about Scott, it was that he refused to eat anything beef. He would avoid red meat altogether if he had to. He shrugged and turned the light back off. He'd never eaten a shepherd's pie, but it looked good, so he wouldn't complain. If she wanted to eat in the dark, he wasn't going to try to stop her. He wasn't sure why it was romantic to not be able to see your food, though. Throughout the meal, Scott felt like he should whisper because the lights were off, but at least the food was good. He had 3 servings before he was done. I like shepherd's pie. I'm glad. She got up to put the dishes in the sink and run water over them so the food wouldn't get caked on. I'll meet you in the living room. Scott stood to go into the living room, wondering what the next phase of their date would be. He looked around the living room with a frown. She'd pushed all the furniture against the walls and her iPod was on top of the coffee table. All the lights in there were off too. What did she have against electricity? Savannah walked into the room and watched Scott stare around him in astonishment. Her husband had to be the most clueless man to ever walk the face of the earth. She hurried around with the lighter in her hand and lit each of the candles until the room was filled with the soft romantic glow of candlelight. When she was finished, she set the lighter down and started the music on her iPod, smiling as the strains of one of her favorite love songs filled the room. She walked to Scott and smiled. "Dance with me?" His eyes widened and he stared at her with shock. "Dance? I don't know how to dance. I'm not looking for fancy footsteps. Just slow dance with me." She took one step closer and put her left hand on his shoulder while she took his with her right. It's just swaying to the music. Scott had never felt quite so big or so clumsy. He was afraid he'd break her toes by stepping on them. Why was she barefoot? Didn't she know she needed steel-toed boots for this? "I can't be held responsible for broken toes," he blurted. She laughed softly, her head on his shoulder. "You're not going to break my toes. Just dance with me." He held her close, but his mind was formulating a plan. If he never lifted his feet, he couldn't step on her, so he'd just sway back and forth. She'd never notice. Would she? Savannah chose to ignore the fact that Scott never really moved. She just enjoyed being held by him as they swayed to the music. After the 3rd song, she stood on tiptoe to kiss him, showing her appreciation for his cooperation during the date night she'd planned. As soon as she kissed him, Scott knew what to do. He opened his mouth and kissed her back, his hands going down to cup her bottom, stroking her through her shorts. He picked her up, helping her wrap her legs around his waist, and stumbled back the 3 feet to the couch, his hands stroking her everywhere. This was something he could understand. Savannah moaned softly into his mouth. She'd known if she could get him to dance with her at all, it would end this way. The man didn't have a romantic bone in his body, no matter how much she wished things were different. It just wasn't in him. Chapter 7. Scott sat atop his horse, watching his men as they rebuilt the fence the bison had knocked down, carefully stringing some electric wire. The bison were proving stubborn about staying on his land, so they needed electric fences to keep them in. Jesse rode up beside him. "Things seem to be going better with that new wife of yours." Scott shrugged. "Sometimes I think so, and sometimes I don't. I agreed to woo her, act like we're courting but still keep bed privileges, 'cause I'm not giving up bed privileges." He cleared his throat, realizing he really shouldn't have said that. "Anyway, I can't seem to do anything right in her eyes. I took her flowers, and she never even said thank you." "Really?" Jesse asked skeptically. He'd known Scott his whole life. "What kind of flowers?" "Well, they were dandelions, but I arranged them really nicely." "You took her dandelions? What did you arrange them in? A beer bottle?" "No. It was a root beer bottle. No alcohol involved." He wasn't that stupid when it came to women. "Scott? You need to learn how to court a woman. You need to order her some flowers and have them delivered while you're out on the range." "How do I know what kind to get?" Scott had never ordered flowers for a woman. How was he supposed to know how to do it? "Call them and tell them you need an apology bouquet. They'll put something together for you." Scott sighed. "What else can I do?" Why don't you buy her a nice gift? Something you think she'll really use. Frivolous is nice, and the flowers cover that, but sometimes women like to receive stuff they can use too. Scott's eyes lit up. I know exactly what to get her. Thanks for the advice, Jesse. Jesse opened his mouth to ask what the gift was, but obviously thought better of it. Just treat her kindly. Take her dancing. We danced in the living room last night. She shut off all the lights, lit candles, and shoved the furniture against the walls. I was afraid to lift my feet for fear I'd stomp on her. Jesse shook his head. Boy, you need to go home and get on that computer of yours, and look up books on how to court a woman. You are clueless, and we can't spend the whole workday with me coaching you on what to say to your wife. Our bull bison are better at courting the cows than you are at courting your wife. You'd think you'd know what to do by now. How could I? I've never had a wife before. There's a reason for that, boy. I promise. He sighed. Only way you'd ever get a woman to agree to marry you is if she didn't talk to you first. Scott made a face. He wanted to argue, but he knew the other man was right. Asterisk. 2 days later, after she'd finished the lunch dishes, Savannah settled down in Scott's office to see if any new teaching jobs had been posted for the area. The problem was, the area was so small that there really weren't many jobs of any kind unless you wanted to ranch. There was a knock at the front door, and she jumped to her feet. It was the first visitor they'd had since she arrived. Who could be there? It was too late in the day for Jehovah's Witnesses, but much too early for Mormons. She didn't know of anyone else who would just stop by during the day. When she got to the door, she was surprised to see a delivery truck with a flower bouquet on the side, and a young man holding a bouquet of flowers. Are you Mrs. Ward? He asked. She nodded. Yes, I am. She was confused. Her husband didn't know how to send flowers the real way. Who could they be from? She took them and thanked him. Give me just a moment, and I'll get a tip for you. No, that's all right, ma'am. The tip was paid already. Oh, well, thank you. She took them in and shut the door, setting the vase full of beautiful roses on the counter. She took the card and closed her eyes, shaking her head after she read it. Her husband did not have the makings of a poet. Violets are blue, roses are red, hope this works, to get you into my bed, Scott. She couldn't help but laugh. The man was so clueless it was almost funny. Asterisk. When Scott got home, he noticed the flowers on the counter. He walked into the kitchen and hugged Savannah from behind. You got my flowers. Yes, they're beautiful. Thank you. She turned and kissed him sweetly. Did you write the poem yourself? He nodded. I could give Shakespeare a run for his money, couldn't I? He winked at her, a grin covering his face. Sure, she said uncertainly. May I give a bit of advice, though? I guess. Don't quit your day job. He made a face. I tried. You did, and I really appreciate it. The flowers are lovely. She picked up the bowl of mashed potatoes she'd just finished mixing. If you'll carry these to the table, I'll get the rest. He carried the bowl to the table, before running back to wash his hands and face. His mother may not have taught him to be a ladies' man, but she had made sure that he knew to always wash his hands and face before a meal. After dinner, they were sitting together on the back porch, watching the sunset. It was Savannah's favorite time of day. I got a call from Principal Moore today. You did? He didn't want her to get the job, but he did. That job was only for 1 semester, and he didn't want her to make a full year's commitment. He hated feeling so conflicted. I did. He offered me the job for the fall semester. The pay was a little higher than I expected, probably because he realizes that not many would want to commit for just half the school year. Did you accept it? He held his breath as he waited for her answer. He didn't know if he wanted the answer to be yes or no. Yes, I did. I thought it was a good compromise for us. She turned to him fully, sitting sideways on the swing. I'll need to go in for an orientation next week. He nodded. That's fine. What day? He'd have to drive her, so he needed to rearrange his schedule. Thursday. If I can, it would be nice to have my license by then. That way you won't have to always drive me. She watched his face as she suggested driving herself, hoping he'd be agreeable. We'll go Monday for your road test. You're ready. He was reluctant to give her the freedom the license would bring, but he had no idea why. She smiled, her face lighting up. I was hoping you'd say that. We'll go car shopping then too. He cupped her cheek in one hand, kissing her softly. Congratulations on the job. However mixed his feelings were about the subject, she'd worked hard for her degree, and she'd interviewed well. She deserved to be congratulated. She knew how hard it must be for him to say that to her. Thank you. I'll still do my best to have dinner ready every night. She sucked in a breath, trying to find the best way to ask the question that was on her mind. How would you feel if we brought back the housekeeper you used before we married? Just for the school year? It would be one less thing for me to worry about. He frowned, hating the idea. His mother had done everything around the house for as long as he could remember. He had to keep telling himself that she wasn't his mother, though. She'd been raised differently. Finally he nodded. I think we'll need to. Savannah moved into his arms, hugging him tightly. Thank you. She could tell it was against his nature to agree, but she was glad when he did. He kissed the top of her head. You're welcome. After they'd gone back inside, he remembered the gift he'd planned to give her. Flipping off the light switch, he said, I have a surprise for you. I'll bring it upstairs. She nodded and smiled. Someone must be giving him husband lessons. 2 gifts in one day? Who was this man? She went into the bedroom and changed into a light nightgown. It was green with spaghetti straps and the hem came to mid-thigh. Perfect for wearing in the summer. She slipped into bed, pulling the covers up under her arms. Even after almost 2 weeks of marriage, she was shy with him. It was hard to let go of the taboos that were still in her mind about men seeing her body. Scott walked into the room with a big grin on his face, carrying a box wrapped in Christmas paper. She could see the paper had been dusty, but he'd wiped it off with his hand. He put the gift on the bed in front of her, and her first thought was that she'd have to wash all the bedding the next day. It was due, though, so she bit her tongue. She carefully tore the paper off the box, wondering who the gift had really been for. When she opened it, she found something she'd wanted, but seeing it made her angry. It was a beautiful new KitchenAid mixer. It had everything for making gourmet meals from scratch. Remembering their fight, all she could think was that he was trying to force her to cook for him. She couldn't say that to him, though. It was an expensive gift. Thank you, she said softly, not wanting to seem ungrateful. Who was the gift originally for? My mother. She died right before Christmas, and I'd already wrapped it. He watched her face for the excitement he expected and was disappointed when it seemed to make her sad. I'll use it. She pushed the wrapping to the floor and set the gift beside it. She didn't know what else to say. He'd acted like he had a special gift for her, but it was covered in dust and meant for his dead mother? Really? She slipped under the covers and closed her eyes. How could she possibly voice her regrets? She fought to keep the tears inside, hoping that someday he'd understand how to make her feel good. Scott couldn't figure out what her problem was. He'd given her a nice gift. It was something his mother had specifically asked for, and he knew she liked to cook. What had he done wrong now? Asterisk. Savannah was cold to him the following morning, and Scott was still uncertain what he'd done wrong. Finally, halfway through his eggs and bacon, he just asked, "What did I do wrong?" He'd never know how to do things right if she didn't tell him what he'd done wrong. She sighed. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just kind of hurt my feelings." It was the simplest way to put it. She hoped he wouldn't press her on it, because she was certain she'd make him mad. "How? I really don't understand." "I was trying to make you happy by giving you a nice gift. It was something my mother had specifically asked for, so I know it was a good gift." It was a good gift, if it had been given differently. She struggled to find the words to explain something that she really felt like he should already know. "When you told me you had something for me, I got excited. I thought you had found something just for me that was special. What you had was a Christmas gift you had purchased for your mother, before you knew I existed, and you were recycling it." She shook her head. "If you had told me something like, I got my mom a gift right before she died, and I think you might be able to use it, it would have been different. Even if you'd wrapped it in new paper, I probably wouldn't have known the difference. But we had a fight about me cooking very recently, and you gave me a cooking appliance that wasn't really intended for me in the first place and still had dust on it. How is that supposed to make me feel?" He looked down at his hands, feeling badly. "I had no idea it would upset you." "Really?" "I know, and that makes me feel like I'm doing something wrong for getting upset about it, but truly? I feel like you aren't trying to get to know me at all. Like you're pigeonholing me with every other woman you've ever met. What do you really know about me? You know I'm your wife, but what do you know about Savannah? I existed before we met, you know." She knew she was pushing too far with her words, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. He had to understand how he was making her feel. Scott felt a burst of anger. He'd tried hard to get to know her, and felt like he was doing better every day. Why would she criticize him like that? "Is there something wrong? Are you feeling PMS coming on? 'Cause I can clear out now if I need to." "PMS? Really?" "No, I'm not feeling PMS unless PMS stands for prepubescent male stupidity." She got up and started clearing the table, smashing things together harder than she should have. She took his plate and scraped what was left into the trash can. "Hey! I wasn't done eating that." "You are now." She put his plate into the dishwasher and turned on the garbage disposal. There was nothing in there, she just wanted to drown out the sound of his voice for a moment. When she finally stopped it, she turned, and he was gone. It was a good thing, because she wasn't certain she could have refrained from throwing something. What a way to start a marriage. After she'd finished the breakfast dishes, she picked up her cell phone. It was much too early to be calling Dr. Simpson, but maybe she wouldn't have any patience with her yet. "This is Dr. Lachelle Simpson. Please tell me you make house calls." The laughter from the other end of the line made Savannah consider homicide. For all she knew, the good doctor had already hired a bodyguard. "Oh, Savannah. You're doing so much better than you were the last time you called. I can tell just by the tone of your voice. Last time you were really ready to leave him. This time, you're just exasperated with him." "What did he say?" "Men say some of the most asinine things, don't they?" The doctor's voice was calm and soothing, and it just made Savannah angrier. "He asked me if I had PMS, when I was explaining very politely why it's not okay to give your wife a gift you bought for your dead mother. It still had dust on it." Dr. Simpson burst out laughing, and it didn't sound like she'd ever stop. "Oh my word. He didn't." "He did. I thought you screened him." The laughter stopped. "I will fly out this weekend if you really think you need me, but I think you two can make this work without my intervention. Just remember, you both have the same goal in mind. You want to make the marriage work. You both want children." Everything he does is just what I like to call dumb man syndrome. Once he learns how you want him to treat you, things will get better. I hope so. I'm trying, really I am. I know you are. Dr. Simpson sighed. Let me know by Thursday if you need me to fly out for the weekend, and I will. Thank you. I think I just needed to say something to someone. I don't have any girlfriends out here yet. I don't dare call my mother, because she's waiting for a call to come identify my body. Savannah let her voice trail off, knowing she sounded overly dramatic, but her mother really was certain Scott was going to kill her at any moment. The laughter came rolling over the phone line. Go take a shower. Or a long hot bath. Have you considered investing in a hot tub? Water is so calming. That's a good idea. Maybe I'll tell Scott I won't kill him if he'll just get me something to calm my nerves. You know, like a hot tub, a week alone on an island in the South Pacific, or even Valium would work. I'd take Valium. You have a good day. Keep your sense of humor about the things he does. Imagine what it would have been like for a fly on the wall watching him give you that gift. Savannah sighed. Don't remind me of the gift. She put soap into the dishwasher and closed it. Thanks for talking to me, Dr. Simpson. I feel much better. Savannah did the laundry while dancing to music on her iPod. She was determined to not only stay content in her marriage, but to not let her husband drive her crazy. He really was a good man, and she enjoyed being with him most of the time. Asterisk. Scott waited until the men were out of earshot before he talked to Jessie. I can't figure out what I did wrong. I did what you said and gave her a nice gift. What did you give her? A really nice electric mixer. Scott said, throwing up one hand while he kept hold of his gelding's reins with the other. Why wouldn't she be happy with that? Jessie made a face. Didn't you tell me you two had a fight just last week about how she thought she should be able to go to work, and you said she should stay home and cook? Scott nodded. Yeah. So? So why would you get her a kitchen appliance after having that fight? Have you lost your ever-loving mind? Scott frowned, recognizing the wisdom in the older man's words. Well, I didn't think of that. I just wanted to give her something nice, and I had that gift all wrapped in the closet already. Jessie stopped his horse. Why did you already have the gift wrapped in the closet? I got it for my mom for Christmas right before she died. There was no reason to waste it. He knew Jessie was a frugal man, so he'd understand. Jessie closed his eyes, pinching the top of his nose as if to ward off a headache. Please tell me it wasn't wrapped in Christmas paper. Well, did you tell her it was for your dead mother? Jessie's voice was a near yell by that point. I couldn't lie to her. Scott felt more stupid by the moment. Savannah had tried to explain the problem very calmly, and she'd made no sense to him. Jessie, on the other hand, was coming through loud and clear. I probably shouldn't have asked her if she was getting PMS when she got mad at me about it either, huh? Okay, boy, did you buy that book I suggested? Scott shook his head. Not yet. Here's what I think you should do. First, call that doctor lady that set you two up. Did she realize how hopeless you were? Jessie asked. Scott frowned. I don't mean to be hopeless. I really thought she'd like it. Jessie shook his head. I worry about you sometimes, but then I remember your dad was just as clueless when he first married. Your mom left him for a month once. She didn't. He'd always thought of his parents as the happiest couple alive. She got sick and tired of your dad's cluelessness. Jessie shrugged. That doesn't matter now, though. Here's what I think you need to do. Call that doctor lady and ask for advice. Ask her what she thinks you should get Savannah as a gift. Whatever she says, you do it. Exactly. And then you buy her flowers and chocolate. Like a whole vat of chocolate. But find out first if she likes milk chocolate or dark chocolate. Nuts or no nuts. Those things are important to women. So you want me to call Lachelle Simpson to find out what kind of gift to get my wife, and then find out if she prefers dark or milk chocolate? And if she likes her chocolate with nuts or without? And then buy her flowers and chocolates and whatever gift Lachelle wants me to get her? It sounded like a lot to him, but he'd do it. He didn't want to lose his wife, even for a month. Sometimes he wished she understood him better, but he was falling in love with her, and didn't want to be away from her. Yes. And then you need to pray as hard as you can pray, because most women would have not only left you by now, they'd have come after you with a frying pan first. Jesse kicked his horse to get him moving again. And whatever you do, don't buy her exercise equipment, a vacuum cleaner, or answer the question, do I look fat in this? This is important. Are you listening to me? Scott nodded, taking mental notes. I promise. I won't ever do any of that. I'm not stupid. You're not exactly proving that with your actions lately. Scott sighed dramatically. I guess I'm not. I'll make the call and see what I can do. Asterisk. Savannah took a long hot bath just before Scott came home for dinner. Dr. Simpson told her it was calming, and she knew that the calmer she was when Scott got home, the better their evening would be. She was determined not to throw anything at him and to pretend he had done nothing wrong. She was putting supper on the table when he walked in. Instead of giving him the cold shoulder, which was what she really wanted to do, she walked to him and kissed him. Did you have a good day? He was surprised at her show of affection, but not one to pass up an opportunity. He dipped her over his arm and kissed her passionately. Day was good, except I kept worrying about my beautiful wife. I miss you when I'm not with you. She looked at him with surprise. It was the first time he'd indicated any feelings for her other than passion. She liked it. I'm glad you're home, she said simply, and she found she meant it. She wanted to make him happy, and she knew he wanted to make her happy. He just had no clue how to go about it. After dinner, while they sat on the back porch as they did most nights, he asked, "Do you like chocolate?" If she was surprised by the question, she didn't give any indication. Yes, I'm alive, therefore I like chocolate. What woman didn't like chocolate? And if he was going to get her chocolate to make up for being clueless? She'd take it. Dark or milk? He asked without missing a beat. Milk, of course. Dark is too bitter in my opinion. Nuts or no nuts? Why would anyone ruin good chocolate by putting nuts in it? Now, if you want to add caramel, I'm all over that. She looked up at him from where her cheek rested on his shoulder. Why do you ask? I was thinking about getting you a vat of chocolate to swim around in to make up for my stupidity. She laughed. You're not stupid. You're just, we'll call it relationally challenged. He stroked her back. That sounds much nicer than stupid. I accept. She smiled. Is this your way of apologizing? Nope. It's just declaring my intent to apologize for being relationally challenged. Oh? That's all I'm telling you for now. He kissed her forehead. Want to go take your driver's test in the morning? I think you're ready. I'd like that a lot. She hated having to wait for him to do every little thing. Grocery shopping alone sounded like pure bliss at that point. And after we'll go car shopping. She had looked up sports cars online, intending to make him a little crazy. Does this mean you're going to buy me a Jaguar or a Porsche? I'd take either one. He shook his head. How about we get your license, and then we test drive a couple of cars? I'd like to see you in an SUV or a minivan. Both would be great when the kids come. Secretly, she agreed with his assessment of the best car for her, but she wanted to try to push his buttons. But the Jaguar has such sleek lines. Think of how fast I could go with a Jaguar. Absolutely not. I've seen what you can do in my pickup. A sports car is not in your future, dear wife. She pouted. May I at least test drive one? See how fast it can go? No. Absolutely not. He looked at her with alarm. You don't want to lose your license the day you get it. Do I get to at least have some say in the color of my car? He thought about that for a minute. Anything but red. I think red would inspire you to go faster. Well, that's silly, but since I don't particularly like red, I don't care. She was very excited at the prospect of taking her driving test. Do you really think I'm ready to get my license? He nodded. I know you've practiced around the ranch every day. When we've driven on the roads, you've had no problems. Yeah, I think you're going to do great. He leaned down and kissed her softly. After you pass, we'll pick out a car. I'll even take you out to lunch. I get to eat someone's cooking other than my own? That sounds so awesome. Scott sighed. Married for less than a month and already you're complaining about cooking. What are you going to be like in a year? Savannah grinned. I'll be cooking every night just like I do now, but I might be complaining about it a bit more. She stood up and took his hand, pulling him up from the swing. Seriously, I like to cook, and I enjoy cooking for you. I just like a break on occasion. She pulled him back into the house through the kitchen and toward the stairs. Where are we going? He asked. Bed. He grinned. I was hoping you'd say that.